The desert stretched endless and unforgiving, the horizon wavering under the blaze of the late afternoon sun. Heat shimmered off the sand like a living thing, curling and bending the world into mirages. The cowboy rode with steady rhythm, his horse's hooves muffled against the soft earth, his hat pulled low to shield his eyes from the merciless glare. He was a man used to silence, both around him and within. For years, he had chosen this emptiness over the risk of feeling again. The desert didn't ask questions. It didn't pry into the scars he carried, or the heart he had buried under layers of dust and steel. Out here, no one expected him to be more than a shadow moving across the wasteland. That was enough. At least, it had been. It was a flicker of movement that broke the stillness. At first, he thought it another mirage. The desert was full of tricks, cruel ones. But as his eyes sharpened, narrowing beneath the brim of his hat, he saw her. A woman, staggering across the sand, each step a battle against the sinking pull of exhaustion. Her hair hung loose and wild, strands plastered against her face by sweat. Her clothes were torn, faded once fine fabric now reduced to rags by wind and sun. She moved like someone who had been walking too long without water, her arms trembling, her knees buckling with each desperate stride. The cowboy reined in his horse, the animal tossing its head as if sensing the strangeness of the scene. He dismounted, boots crunching against the brittle ground. He didn't call out right away. People left to the desert were often left for a reason, and he wasn't a man who tangled with other folks' business lightly. But something about the tilt of her chin, even in ruin, stopped him from turning his back. She stood there, swaying, her eyes dark with defiance even as her lips cracked from thirst. She met his gaze and did not beg. That surprised him. Most in her state would have fallen to their knees, pleading for water, for mercy. But she looked at him as if daring him to walk away, daring him to be like the rest who had abandoned her. It was that fire, faint but alive in her eyes, that made his chest tighten against his will. He pulled the canteen from his saddlebag and held it out. Her hands trembled as she grasped it, but when the water touched her mouth she drank like someone pulling life back into their bones. She coughed, then steadied, drops of water running down her chin, darkening the dust on her throat. She stopped before draining it dry, as if remembering manners too deep to abandon, and handed it back with a nod that was almost regal. "You'll die out here," he said, his voice low, gravel rubbed raw by silence. Her lips parted, but her voice was hoarse when it came. "I've already been left to." The words cut sharper than a blade. He should have turned then, mounted his horse, and let her fate be her own. That was the safe choice. But instead, he found himself offering a hand. She hesitated, her pride a shield even in her weakness, but eventually her fingers touched his. He pulled her toward his horse, lifting her as though she weighed nothing. She let out a small sound, not quite pain, not quite surrender, and then settled into the saddle. He mounted behind her, his arm steadying her slight frame. The desert wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of sage and dust. She leaned against him, her head brushing the edge of his shoulder. The contact was feather-light, yet it stirred something inside him that he had buried years ago. He told himself it was necessity. She was weak, she needed support, but the steady rhythm of her breathing against him was more than survival. It was dangerous. They rode in silence, the sun sinking low, painting the sky with streaks of blood and fire. He should have been thinking about where to take her, about how far the nearest town lay, about food and shelter. But instead, his thoughts tangled with questions he didn't want to ask. Who had cast her out? What crime, or what sin, could warrant leaving someone to die in the sand? He didn't ask because her silence was its own answer, and maybe because part of him feared the truth would only make her harder to let go. As the first stars bled through the purple sky, she shifted, murmuring words he almost didn't catch. "Why help me? You don't know me." He tightened his hold slightly, keeping her steady in the saddle. "Don't need to." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. He already wanted to know her, more than he'd wanted to know anyone in a long, long time. Her presence pressed against him like a weight he hadn't expected, soft, fragile, alive. He had told himself long ago that his heart was buried deep enough no woman could ever find it again. Yet here she was, an outcast in tattered rags, and somehow she had unearthed it without even trying. By the time they stopped for the night, the desert was alive with shadows. He built a fire, its crackle the only sound between them. She sat across from him, knees pulled close, her face lit by the flames. For the first time, he saw her without the haze of heat and exhaustion. She was beautiful, not in the polished way of town women, but in the raw strength that shone through her weariness. She caught him looking, and for a heartbeat her guarded expression softened. He looked away, feeding another branch into the fire, but his chest burned hotter than the flames. He had saved her life, yes. But he knew the truth already. Somewhere between the moment he handed her the canteen and the moment she leaned her head against his shoulder, she had stolen something from him. Something he thought he'd buried forever in the silence of the desert. She had stolen his heart. And he wasn't sure he wanted it back. The desert air cooled with the fall of night, the heat of the day bleeding out of the sand until only shadows and silver light remained. The cowboy crouched near the small fire he had built, its orange glow flickering against the canyon walls, painting jagged teeth into the stone. He moved with the unhurried patience of a man who had learned to survive by doing things steady, one at a time. He poured water into a dented pot, dropped in dried beans and jerky, and set it above the flames. He didn't speak, not because he couldn't, but because he didn't trust words anymore. Words had failed him once, in a life he no longer allowed himself to remember. Now, silence was safer. The woman sat wrapped in his long coat, the fabric swallowing her frail frame, making her look smaller, though there was nothing small about the fire in her eyes. Dust streaked her face, but beneath the grime he could see the shape of someone who had carried more sorrow than she deserved. Her hands, trembling at first, now steadied as the warmth from the coat seeped into her bones. She hadn't asked him who he was, hadn't questioned why he helped. She only sat there, eyes trained on him, as if watching him was proof she had not been abandoned again. She spoke first, her voice raw from thirst, but soft, carrying like the wind in canyon hollows. She told him pieces of herself, not all at once but in fragments, like glass broken on stone. She had been cast out by those who should have protected her, judged too harshly by a world that loved to forget mercy. She had walked until her feet bled, carrying nothing but her shame and the stubborn refusal to lay down in the sand and die. He listened, his face unreadable, the firelight flickering across the shadow of his jaw and the deep lines carved into his skin. Her words slowed, then faltered. She looked down at her hands, twisting them in his coat, her voice trembling as she admitted what she feared most. Not the desert, not the hunger, not the men who had turned their backs on her, but the thought of being unseen, unloved, forever. That struck something in him, a buried ache that pressed against the walls he had built inside. He didn't move at first, didn't speak, he wasn't sure he remembered how. But when she shifted closer, inching toward the fire and toward him, she leaned against him as naturally as if she'd been waiting for him all her life. He stiffened, every muscle tight, heart hammering with a wildness he hadn't felt in years. Her head rested against his chest, listening to the slow thunder of his heartbeat. He thought of pushing her away, of reminding himself she wasn't his to keep, that he had buried his heart deep in the desert long ago. But the weight of her against him broke something open. His hand, rough and scarred, twitched at his side before he let it rise, hesitating, then settling gently across her shoulder. She didn't flinch. She didn't ask for words. She simply stayed. The fire cracked, sparks floating up into the night as the stars stretched endlessly above. The canyon seemed to listen, holding their silence like a secret. For the first time in years, the cowboy's silence wasn't armor, it was a shelter, a space she could breathe in. She sighed, soft and weary, and he felt the sound through his chest. Her breathing steadied, sinking with his, and he knew that without realizing it, she had stolen something he thought he had buried forever. The desert was harsh, merciless to the weak, but it had brought her to him, and in her, he saw not weakness but survival. She was an outcast, yes, but so was he. Two exiles, carved hollow by the same ruthless land, finding in each other the one thing neither thought they'd have again, belonging. He stared into the fire, his hand still resting on her shoulder, the heat of her body seeping into his side. The silence stretched long, but it wasn't empty. It was full, of things unspoken, of wounds unseen, of a promise neither dared to name. And though he had sworn to bury his heart in the desert, that night it beat again, fragile but alive, because of the woman sleeping softly against him.